Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Katherine Anne Porter channel. I have a very special guest with me today I'm very excited about. He obtained graduate degrees at the universities of Munster and Virginia. He taught in the United States as a graduate assistant at the University of Virginia and as an assistant and associate professor at Drury University and as associate and full professor at the University of North Georgia. And from 2006 to 2025, he served as professor of American literature at the University of Freiburg. And he also edited I guess it was a collection of essays called Katherine Anne Porter, Ship of Fools, New Interpretations, and Transatlantic Contexts. So I'm very happy to have Dr. Thomas Austenfeld with me today. And I want to thank you for agreeing to do this interview. And first of all, how are you?
I'm very well, and it's nice to meet you here on this particular channel. Hi, Alan. It's good to see you. And let me just thank you for the kind introduction. For those people out there who may be confused by the mention of Freiburg, I'll just say very quickly, the University of Freiburg in Germany is somewhat better known and somewhat larger than the University of Freiburg in Switzerland.
Mhm.
But it's the latter where I teach. So I've been in Switzerland for these past 19 years, indeed.
Great, great. Okay, thanks for that clarification. And I'm always excited to talk to somebody who knows a lot more about Katherine Anne Porter and her stories than I do. So I'm
I
delighted.
don't know if I qualify, but we'll certainly try.
Well, I'll let you do most of the talking, I'm sure. So let me set the stage, and then you can just kind of take it from there with my first question. The Leaning Tower, which we're going to talk about today, which is the title story of Porter's third collection of stories, it's set in Weimar, Berlin, in toward the end of 1931, actually almost 1932. And I believe at this time Hitler's Nazi party was gaining power. There's even a reference to Hitler, I believe, in the story, referring to like a loud politician with the mustache. I believe
That's right.
that's Hitler. So conditions are kind of ripe at this time for a dictatorial takeover, I guess you could say. And so this is the time that Porter is capturing in her story, the atmosphere of Berlin specifically in Germany at this time. And she describes Germans in all kinds of ways. The words malicious are used, cruel. They're depicted as kind of sad, desperate, impoverished, proud, the whole range of almost caricature, I would say at times. So I guess the first obvious question is how fair and accurate do you think is Porter's depiction of Berlin and Germany and the German people at this time?
Okay, well, that's a big question with a lot of sub-questions, so I will try to take a couple of things in turn.
Sure.
Thank you very much for setting the historical context. I think it's important to keep in mind that the story is set at a particular time, and I think it's important to realize that Porter wrote it from notes, I presume, that she took when she was in Berlin at that moment. She spent a total of, I believe, 5 or 5.5 months in
Hmm.
Germany from late 31 through the spring of 32. And it seems pretty clear early on that Charles Upton, the central consciousness of the story, is her alter ego as somebody who is from America, who is from a small town in Texas, who thinks that there's something to see and find in Berlin, but who is confused, threatened even by the unusual environment and by what's going on there. And just as Charles Upton reacts to what he sees by producing art, namely, in his case, sketches or cartoons, rather, of the people that he sees and the scenes that he witnesses, so Katherine Anne Porter reacts in her artistic fashion, that is to say, by writing a story. And if a cartoon is a form of exaggeration in graphic arts, then satire is a form of exaggeration in the literary arts. So I think everything that Porter is saying, really everything, I have reread the story for this conversation. Everything that Porter is saying clearly has some basis in observed fact, and she is she is, sort of sharpening it to a fine point. She is really trying to get the most out of it in terms of what an observed fact or an observed habit or practice or something might signify. So yes, she probably exaggerates, but no, probably not by much. Because, judging by other historical, non-fictional, but also literary texts of the time, the German population, um, exemplified in this case by the population of Berlin, was feeling quite miserable in 1930, 1931, 1932. We're in the Depression already here. We're at a point where Germany, I guess, is staggering under the weight of reparations it has to pay back from World War One, which is already a long time ago, but 12 or 13 or 14 years in the past, but it's mentally very present. There are still war invalids that are begging in the streets. There is a sense that World War One was lost, but it wasn't the last war. There could be another one coming. And as you correctly said, Hitler's party, the National Socialist Party, is gaining power. But, and this is something Porter doesn't really talk about as far as I remember, it's not the only radical or extreme party that is gaining power. At the particular time, it must have been very difficult to govern Germany with a stable government anyway, because there were fringe parties on both sides, both the communists and the National Socialists that were gaining strength and voters and admiration. And so maybe not by late 1931, but certainly in those critical years from 30 to 33, I think it's not too far a stretch to say that a revolution could have come both from the far right and the far left.
Mm.
Or rather, either or, not both.
Sure.
So in that sense, it's a very dicey moment, and it's a sort of a moment that's on the cusp of something new, which is why it's so interesting that Porter is setting it more or less on New Year's Eve,
Hmm.
and the beginning of a new year, which could be a promise and could also be a disaster.
Okay, great. Yeah, I knew you'd set the stage perfectly. I just thought I would do it briefly and let you take it away. That's great. Because it's very important to know, as you said, when the story is set and where it's set for what Porter's trying to say about civilizations, or maybe about all civilizations. We'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about the symbolism.
Mhm.
Let's talk about the Leaning Tower as a kind of prelude to Ship of Fools, which I've always thought it was. Charles Upton it definitely is an alter ego of Porter and maybe an earlier version of David Scott, I've always thought, because
Mhm.
they're both painters, right? They're both painters.
That sounds right.
Um, and the other characters that he shares the boarding house with, I hope I get these names right as far as pronunciation. There's Otto Busen, Hans van Goring, and Thaddeus May. I believe
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
right.
yeah,
Okay, we got those right.
yeah.
Do you think they have any counterparts in Ship of Fools? I was just curious. I was thinking about this the other day, and I was curious to see what you came up with and see if they match the people I was thinking of. And then what sensibility or aspect of human nature does each of these characters represent?
Yeah, I I figured you might ask that, and I'm going to pull back a little bit and say, yes, I would like to think about the comparability of the story and the novel, and there are lots of reasons why they should be compared. Um, I'm not sure I want to go too deeply into a matchup of characters, because I think it might be more interesting to look at the characters in both texts. In terms of the function that they have for the particular dramatic moment that they describe. So let me sort of wrap this up from the back rather than from the front,
Okay.
and tell me whether you think that's a satisfactory answer. So first, let's look at the analogs and the parallels. So we really have two texts here that are dealing with more or less Weimar Germany, which is to say, for Porter, that's a place and a time that's about to self-destruct for various kinds of reasons. And in the relatively short space of the Leaning Tower, it's a long story as far as Porter goes, but still not a very long story. In the relatively short space of the Leaning Tower, what she has her characters negotiate there are national prejudices. What is a German like? What is a Pole like? What is actually going on? And what is an Austrian like? We have the landlady who is Viennese. And we have a couple of those things also being picked up with more nationalities added in Ship of Fools. But that's about where it stops in terms of the comparability of the setting and the characters, I think, because I believe they have different functions. So first of all, Ship of Fools is a text that has a totally different controlling metaphor in the title. A Ship of Fools and a Leaning Tower are just not the same thing.
Mhm.
A Ship of Fools has a resonance and a history and a sort of a topicality and a topos notion of what a Ship of Fools is, with such a depth that Porter probably didn't really come to that until she had thought about her experiences much longer than
Mhm.
she had um, in writing The Leaning Tower. So it took her living in Basel and reading Sebastian Brandt and The Ship of Fools and thinking about that as an all-encompassing metaphor to come up with the book. And the novel, of course, was called for the longest time No Safe Harbor.
Yes.
And it didn't really get to the Ship of Fool titles until what, the 40s.
Mhm.
Darlene can probably give you the day and the minute when
Yes.
when, when that particular thing happened. So with the Leaning Tower, we have more of a place metaphor, and we have this threat that the tower is going to fall, right?
Yes.
So, but about the characters, they are blunt. They stand for a particular kind of temperament. They're not particularly subtle. Tadeusz Mai, he is a pianist. He is Polish. He is the pianist, right? I'm not mistaken now. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, you're right, right. Okay, so he is the pianist. He is Polish, so you associate him with Chopin, and that's sort of what he stands for, right?
Mhm.
And Hans von Gering is a German student who is part of that tradition of the so-called schlagende Verbindungen, which is like a fraternity that includes fighting, okay? Fighting with what's the word? Not a saber, but a sort of a sword.
Sure. Yeah.
Uh, Thank you. Sword fight. So that it's a point of pride and a point of courage for him to have earned his Mensur scar
Yes.
from that particular fight with his friends. Okay, so that will sort of give him the kind of red badge of courage that allows him to, make the right business connections later in life and be a member of this very select circle of people who have gone through that initiation. Um, then we have Herr Bussen, who is identified by being Plattdeutsch. So he's sort of from northern Germany. He is a slow, somewhat bumbling, somewhat peasant-like character who, for some reason, is in Berlin and is hanging out there. We have the urbane landlady who is trying to put some Viennese elegance on things, but has her own little secrets and wants to spy on her borders and wants to be chummy with them, even though she is clearly not in their age group. And so we have all of these social transgressions and class issues I think class issues are a big, big deal in The Leaning Tower,
Hmm.
that the narrator is trying to negotiate. And the narrator is so American, so strongly steeped in American values, that he does not really fully understand or correctly interpret what these class issues are all about.
And I remember he can't understand, I believe, Goring being so proud of his scar, right?
No, no, no.
Because where he comes from, that would be just evidence you've been in some like dirty fight or something.
Right,
You wouldn't
exactly.
want to, advertise it, but Goring is just
No,
obviously proud. And didn't Frau Rittersdorf's husband in Ship of Fools also have a Mensur scar? Am I
I'm
remembering?
pretty sure. Yes,
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure. Yes,
and
yes,
well,
yes.
of which he was proud too, I believe. Which
Oh yeah, yeah,
she
yeah.
said
Oh yes,
he
yes.
wasn't an actual character in the story, just through in Frau Rittersdorf's memory. But I
Yeah,
believe she said so. It made me think of that when I thought there was some little bit of a parallel there.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
from our point of view and from Porter's point of view, of course, it is a totally absurd practice. In particular, since the real devotees of this cult not only wanted the scar, but they made sure that it looked really bad and bloody,
mhm,
once they had gotten it. So yes, it was obviously treated, and medically seen to, but you somehow had to make sure that it was, as obvious as could be.
mhm, mhm. All right.
But I have now, and I will admit it, I have now sidestepped your
That's
question of which
okay.
character in the story matches which character in the novel. And
I
I
thought
think
maybe, well, I
it
thought
might
maybe,
not be the best, might not be the best way to go about it as far as I'm concerned. It might work for you.
yeah. Well, I couldn't think of, I thought of maybe of Otto, is it pronounced Busson? You said Otto Busson?
Yeah, listen, yeah, yeah, listen.
Might be somewhat similar to Herr Reaver. Maybe
Mhm.
a few things I thought were
Yeah,
similar.
yeah,
The other two, and I thought of Frau Rittersdorf's husband with Hans van Goring, Tadeus, and I'm probably mangling all these names. Tadeus May, the pianist, couldn't quite think of a parallel for him in Ship of Fools, except for some reason I thought of the Basque woodcarver who drowns.
okay.
He made me think
Yes,
of him for some reason. Maybe
yes,
I'll try to elaborate. I'll try to think about that more later. That might be a
sure,
stretch,
sure.
but
Yeah, 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 yeah.
um,
I mean, from the beginning, and I noticed it again when I read it this time. From the beginning, this is a story that has to do with economic class, money, and social differences based on money.
mhm,
Um, and then Charles Upton is worried about his own money. He is poor. He's waiting for his ship and his check to come in from his dad. He's trying to find a cheaper place to live. He worries about what everything costs. And so do the average, or so does the average German
mhm,
that he sees. The only people who don't seem to worry about what stuff costs are the ones with the dogs, the fat
mhm.
ones who are walking their dogs and then
Yes,
holding them up to the window to admire the pigs.
yeah, and that of
Um,
course made me think a little bit of the Huttons with their
mhm,
dogs
yes,
and
yes, the
Ship of
Huttons
Fools.
with
Yeah,
the bulldog baby. Yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, well that's I think we covered that. Maybe some of my
Good.
comparisons a little bit of a stretch, but okay, so let's go to the conversation, that great conversation they have in the cabaret.
Yeah.
Um, and for some reason, I remember that more than other parts of the story. And you have all these sort of different people, different viewpoints. This also may have been what Germany was like at this time. So, how truthful would you say are the statements that each? And I know it's a lot to cover. It's a long conversation, so feel free to
Mhm.
condense as much as you need to.
Yeah.
But how truthful are the statements that each person makes, or is it all just sort of, I don't know, nationalism, prejudice, and bluster?
Um, that doesn't need to be an either or question. I think both parts can be true.
Okay.
I think it's entirely possible that people would have a conversation like this, especially after a couple of glasses of beer or wine or whatever it is that they're drinking at that particular moment, that they would um, sort of sit back and exchange prejudices. That wouldn't surprise me at all. And that those prejudices would be built on an understanding of of history and of their place in it, and of their place in it as members of a particular nation or ethnicity, that they have grown up with since early childhood. This is a real sort of opening a bracket, but I'm going to open this bracket and then close it again. Whenever I read this story or stories like it, I think of the musical South Pacific, which of course is a little bit later,
Mhm.
uh, early 1940s. But there's a song in there in which Lieutenant Cable, who sort of is posted to this South Sea island, sings a song about prejudice, and it has the lines in it: "You've got to be carefully taught to hate all the people your relatives hate, before you are 6 or 7 or 8. You've
Mhm.
got to be carefully taught." Now I'm closing the bracket here. Um, there is there is a truth in that statement about how you come by your prejudices, in particular with respect to which other people you should hate. That probably come out late of an evening when you're sitting in a bar and you don't know what you're talking about and you're
Mhm.
half drunk. And these are young people that are going out. They're competing over the attentions of Luther, and they're sort of, always a step away from a fist fight, maybe. And so they're trading insults over, who has more sense of nationality, who has more national pride, who will win the next war, stuff like that. So I don't think it's that far-fetched. The other piece of evidence that I thought of in getting ready for this conversation is a famous German novel by Alfred Döblin, Berlin Alexanderplatz, which was published, I believe, in 1929 or thereabouts. Please don't hold me to this. I don't have my Wikipedia open here, so I
Mhm.
can't really check it. But it's a quite a famous novel and a literary masterpiece that describes the life of the poorer people, you could say the proletariat in Berlin. There's a guy who was gotten out of prison and who was always sort of close to going back into it, and who is negotiating the complicated life of, well, interwar Berlin, with its huge chasms between people who are going to cabarets and have money and have fun and party the night away, and people who can barely put a piece of bread in their mouth or a roof over their heads. So it's a much longer novel. It must be 400 pages or more. We read it in high school, so this is a very long time ago. But it evokes scenes that are not dissimilar to Katherine Anne Porter's scenes in The Leaning Tower. And
Mhm.
I deduce from that that her description, her assessment of Berlin is quite truthful, even if satirically exaggerated at times for literary purposes.
Yeah. I remember when they all come back from the cabaret and they're kind of a mess. I think like going up the stairs and they expect the landlady to scold them, or it's like they need to be scolded, but she
Yeah.
doesn't do it. She doesn't do it. I think that's kind of symbolic, which kind of leads me to my next question about the symbolism in the story, because I've read some pretty bizarre interpretations of what the Leaning Tower itself symbolizes. Maybe you could tell our audience what the Leaning Tower is in the context of the story, what Charles does to it, and what, in your opinion, overall does the Leaning Tower symbolize?
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you to sort of backfill that answer later and tell me about the strange interpretations that you've read, because I have not spent extra time on looking those up. But
Mhm.
here is the gist of the narrative. So early on his actual inspection visit to the room, Charles is in this apartment for the first time, and he's thinking about whether he can take the room or he can't take the room, and it seems too expensive and too sort of, plushy and stuffy and everything. And in his embarrassment, he sort of puts a hand back and leans it on a table, and a little plaster version of the Leaning Tower of Pisa crumbles in his hands. And it's a disaster, socially and in every other way. And now he is caught, he's stuck, he has to take the room. His future landlady is absolutely crestfallen, and says something like, well, this was an irreplaceable souvenir from my husband and a trip that we took to Italy. And she's really playing this up.
Mhm.
And then Charles is stuck with being in the room. Later on, the Leaning Tower has been repaired. It's been glued back together. Although I think it's like a visibly glued back together, so it doesn't look like new, but it is back. And he finds it again. I don't have the page reference here, but there it is, and it's sort of its old rickety self somehow. Um, so because it's the title of the story, The Leaning Tower and Other Stories, and because Porter placed the story with that title very prominently in her collections, either as the title of a book of stories, or as the concluding story to the section of shorter texts before we get to the trilogy, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, and the two others. She must have thought of it as a very potent image. Now, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, of course, hasn't fallen yet, since it's been built. But it has to be watched, and it has been stabilized more than once, I'm
Mhm.
sure. And it is clearly, as it in a story like this, it clearly is a political symbol, for an old civilization, that takes pride in its history and doesn't know that it's about to crumble. And that seems the easiest, the most straightforward, and also the most potent explanation of what the Leaning Tower stands for. And Katherine Anne Porter has a fairly easy time coming up with this, because while she put Berlin 1931 under the story, she didn't actually finish it until 10 years later, for publication in the Southern Review in 41 or in 42. And so she knew by that time what had happened to Germany and how it had descended into barbarism and into war, and had betrayed whatever culture and history it thought it might have stood for prior to that. Okay, your turn.
Oh no, well I can't remember all the, and it's been a long time since I read criticism. I do remember Givner's interpretation in Porter's biography. I thought was a little far fetched, but now I can't remember exactly what she said. But it's funny. I mean, obviously, it just seems like it. I've always thought it represents sort of civilization, the fragility of civilization is always teetering on the edge, civilization
Hmm,
on the verge of collapse,
okay.
that kind of thing. And it's funny, I don't remember that as much as I remember the cupids on the roof. For some reason, that sticks with me more. The statues
Yeah,
of cupids look like they're falling off the roof, and of course, that's human excesses that lead to the fall of civilization. For some
right.
reason, I remember that more than I remember that. It's
Okay.
called the Leaning Tower. It's both kind of the same. Both kind of saying the same thing.
Yeah, can I jump in there?
Yeah,
Uh,
sure.
so it's interesting to me, that you read this, on even on an even larger scale in terms of ruin of civilization or civilizations. Um, I'm not sure I'm ready to go quite that far out with my frame of reference. I think she is specifically referring to Germany and or some kind of old Europe, that is composed of, say, Germany, France, Poland, and whatever large powers, Italy, Britain maybe, that is tearing itself to pieces, and World War One didn't suffice to tear it to pieces.
Mhm.
So civilization, I think that large statement about pessimism or cultural pessimism or civilizationary pessimism, that's not the right adverb or adjective. Civilizational pessimism probably doesn't come to Porter until the late 40s or the early 50s, when she writes
Mhm.
about the atomic bomb and a couple of other things. I think that's when it gets really large and really desperate. So I'm willing to sort of make this a very European leaning tower,
Okay.
rather than something else. About the Cupids. The Cupids. Okay, so what are the Cupids? The Cupids are these absurd, overdone figures that Charles Upton sees out of his room on the um, well, on the roof or
Hmm.
on the gutter, I guess, of the house that is across the street.
Hmm.
Uh, and they get wet in the rain and they get warm in the sun and they still keep hanging there in their absurd poses. To somebody like Charles Upton, that's a trouvaille. I mean, it's something that he's finding there. And as a caricaturist and a cartoonist and somebody who sort of has a sharp eye and a sharp view of humanity, I think he must just be delighted with the absurdity of it, and scoff at it at the same time.
Yes,
Because
yes.
they're completely frivolous. They have no point whatsoever.
Hmm.
They're not even beautiful or pretty. They're
Hmm.
just like some Germans put garden dwarves into their
Hmm.
gardens.
Hmm.
They're neither beautiful nor pretty. They're absurd. But it's their garden, so they can put in it
Hmm.
whatever they want.
Hmm. Sure, sure. Um, Okay, let's take this in a little bit of another direction. I'm always interested a little bit in how much of Porter's stories mirror sort of what happened to her in her life. How much of it is, because she always talks about her stories as reporting things
Mhm.
she's either witnessed or things she's experienced. So, do you know if, because Charles Upton has a couple of humiliating experiences too in this story. So I was wondering, did Porter herself have any of the experiences that you know of that Upton has in the story, or does it all just come from her imagination and her observations of Berlin when she lived there?
Well, it has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, and whether she takes her own experiences or those of people she meets there, Um, I am not really able to tell because I'm not one of Porter's biographers, and
Hmm.
I don't have access to all of the details there. But it seems to me one method of Porter's is to observe and then to turn it into fiction. And to present that fiction in a way that it looks like truth or takes on a character of truth that is just a fictional truth rather than a reporter's truth. I mean, she's almost like a new journalist there from the 1960s, even though it's a different time, where she doesn't give us an objective view of the facts only that can be proven and checked and measured and counted. Um, but she gathers those impressions and they become something that is fiction, but that is still a truthful statement.
Hmm.
And so, in that sense, I think the Berlin experiences fall into that same category, with one important difference or one important distinction from some other stories. This text strikes me truly as realistic. I'm not saying everything happened just the way that she describes it, but if you compare it to Flowering Judas, that happens in a much more dreamlike atmosphere.
Hmm.
And it isn't set on a particular day or during a particular week. It is sort of happening in a sequence of being in Mexico. Whereas this story is set on particular days and in a particular place, and she mentions the street names. I mean, this
Hmm.
is
Yeah.
awfully specific. She mentions the street names of where she sees the prostitute and the poor people who are begging, and the places where Charles Upton is looking for housing. You can identify those places,
Hmm.
and you can sort of reimagine what they looked like in 1931. They don't look the same anymore because Berlin was, laid into dust during World War II. But still, this is extremely particular and focused and specific, and that's why I'm calling it much more realistic than much of Porter's other fiction.
I remember the boy at the end of Ship of Fools. He's landing in Bremerhaven. Isn't most of Bremerhaven destroyed? I think by the end of the war, I believe.
I don't specifically know that, but I would think so. It was
Yeah,
close enough to Britain to be fairly easily bombed, and of course, it was one of the two major German seaports next to
yeah.
Hamburg. So
I don't know if
that's
it was totally destroyed, but it was pretty close to. I think close
yeah,
to.
yeah,
Um, and this kind of brings me to the, if I'm remembering this correctly, I think Porter said that she had either met Hitler or she saw Hitler someplace, and she also was briefly involved with one of Hitler's henchmen, I guess you'd call him. I think it was Goering, and she writes about that. And you have to take everything Porter says with a grain of salt and fact check everything she says. I know people call
yeah,
her a pathological liar. I try to be nicer, but I just call her a storyteller. I call her a born storyteller. Always has to tell a good story. You don't want to bore your audience, right? So you
yeah,
kind of add things, embellish things, exaggerate
yeah,
things, and
yeah,
maybe. But with her, you really have to, and her biographers have done a great job of doing this
yes,
dissecting what she said, telling us
yeah,
what's true and what's not
yes,
true.
yes.
So how much of what I just said though is true, do you think, as far as because I can't remember, I believe the story about meeting Hitler is not true, or even seeing Hitler, but the story about Goering is true. Is that right?
That's exactly the recollection I have from the
Yeah.
various things I've read about it. So I would assume that by this time, 1931, 1932, it's entirely possible that she would have seen Hitler give a speech.
Mhm.
Because, I mean, we're not talking about a provincial town here. We're talking about Germany's
Sure.
capital.
Sure.
So this is where he would show up and give speeches. Whether she attended any speech or rally, I cannot personally say anything about because I don't have that evidence at my disposal at this particular moment. That she would have met him personally is extremely far-fetched and
Sure.
probably highly unlikely, if not impossible. Now, Hermann Göring, that's another story. They apparently went out for an evening and went
Mhm.
dancing. It's hard to imagine, and I don't think that that Porter went back for a second date, even though the episode in the Leaning Tower, when somebody comes and rings the doorbell, you know, Goering is gone for clearly she is calling Hans von Goering based on Hermann Goering, who later was you know one of the senior henchmen. He was, you know, chief of the SS and a few other things. Um, Not at that time yet. It's not impossible that they met socially for a night.
Mhm.
Um, Hermann Göring was a rather, let me say, large and rotund figure. Um, I mean, he was famous for being fat. So
Mhm.
it I can't see how those two would have gotten together or how this would have happened.
Mhm.
But out of sheer curiosity and naivete, maybe Porter fell in with him. Now, about the the realism of this. There were a couple of, and I have written about this. I wrote a book a long time ago called American Women Writers and the Nazis. Um, there are these four American women, Kay Boyle, Katherine Anne Porter, Jean Stafford, and Lillian Hellman,
Mhm.
who interacted with German and Austrian culture in the 1930s. And they're kind of a group of expatriates that's very different from the expatriates of the 1920s that we all know about. And all four women must have encountered German and Austrian culture with a degree of naivete at the beginning or innocence that would have made it possible to go on a date with Hermann Göring. But after a couple of weeks, you would have realized that that was not what you wanted to be doing.
Yeah, and I think was it Goering that she reported back that she had a conversation with him about, he said something about we need to get that, restore that pure, clean German blood, something like that. And she argued that we were all the whole white race. Was he the one, or maybe somebody else she met in Germany?
Um, I can't say at this particular moment,
That's
so
sort
I
of
would
a vague
demur
notion.
here.
Yeah, she got in some kind of argument with him about that. And that reminds me of what Freytag says in Ship of Fools, almost uses
Yeah,
that same phrase. Well, he doesn't say it, he's thinking it. And
yeah,
I always think of that. Yeah, so we just with Porter, you just don't really know how much is true. And even her biographers have had trouble. I just think you sort of
Yeah.
take everything she says with a grain of salt, and maybe her real truth is in her fiction. As far as how she.
Yes, and it is a different kind of truth
Yeah.
than you would find in encyclopedias, but nonetheless truthful and no less interesting for it. When I first got to know, when I first started looking deeply into Katherine Anne Porter at the University of Virginia, they still had a card catalog. That's how long ago it is.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
the cards in the card catalog said, Porter, Catherine Anne, 1894 to 1980. They were still working on the assumption that she had in fact been born in 1894, which was the story that she spread throughout these years.
Hmm.
It is to me one of the more interesting and one of the more sort of charming, charming lie or little lie about herself that she tried to make herself 4 years younger than she actually was.
I was curious, the four women you mentioned that you wrote about, did Porter meet or know those other three women at all, or have any strong opinions? Because she was a very she had sharp opinions about about
Yeah,
other literary figures. Did she know or meet any of them or have any opinions about them at all?
she definitely had strong opinions about Kay Boyle.
Okay.
Now, Kay Boyle spent a lot more time in Europe than Catherine Anne Porter did. Uh, Kay Boyle came to Europe as early as 1922, when she herself was still very young, as the wife of a French exchange student. And Kay Boyle, sorry, and Porter, who was, of course, 12 years older than Kay Boyle, sort of took on, let's say, a maternal tone in writing criticisms of Boyle's fiction. And she admired some of what Boyle said, but she also criticized her fairly harshly for putting too much of herself into the stories.
Mm, mm.
Um, uh, she criticized Boyle for putting too much of herself, namely Boyle, into the
Yes.
stories.
The thinly
Now, how
veiled
much?
autobiographical story.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. So how much of that also applies to Porter? Certainly, Porter is more circumspect and possibly covers up more of what actually happened than Kay Boyle tended to do.
Mhm.
But yes, she certainly had strong opinions about Kay Boyle, and I'm sure that they met later in life. I don't have that ready to mind at this moment
I
already.
believe Kay Boyle, this is kind of a pattern with Porter. She would start out liking someone and then turn on them. I believe she eventually said about Kay Boyle, how I was deceived by that talent, it rotted early or something like that. And then also she liked Gertrude Stein and then she turned on her. So there's
Yeah.
kind of a pattern there of her sort of changing her opinions about people as she got older.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, with Kay Boyle and with Gertrude Stein, we have two very different generations of expatriate women writers that she is reacting to. And in a sense, I mean, Kay Boyle wrote and wrote and wrote and published and published and published, which Catherine Anne Porter didn't do. She has a select, elegant corpus of work,
Mhm.
whereas Kay Boyle published a novel in every decade starting in the 1920s
Mhm.
until the 1990s. So, I mean, there's just a lot of mass of writing there when it comes to Kay Boyle.
And I have to ask, I like to ask, I think I've asked this of everybody I've interviewed. I haven't interviewed that many people, but so why do you think Porter didn't write more? Or I should say, she actually wrote quite a bit, but why didn't
Yeah.
she write more? And there's a huge body of letters, there's a lot of
Oh, yeah.
nonfiction. She wrote a lot of
Yes.
essays. And
Yes.
why didn't she write more fiction? What was it? Did she have a lot of distractions in her life? Did she have a short attention? I know short attention span has been mentioned. What do you think was the reason she didn't give us more fiction? Because I think the world would have loved to have read anything she wrote. She was such a great writer.
Yeah. One certainly gets the sense that um, the vein that she could have drawn from isn't tapped out. There could have been a lot more there. Um, I do get the sense that she could have written more. Um, it must have something to do with her economically insecure position as a woman writer, at a time when she wanted to be independent, self-supporting, found that the relationships in her life didn't sustain her enough, um, wanted to live the creed that really she was living for art. And art has to be the right stuff, not pot boilers that put food on the table, but that you hate yourself for. And I think sort of it must have been a mix of motives, some of it having to do with very high standards, very
Sure,
high expectations,
sure.
some of it with seeing herself, not as somebody who would compete with Kay Boyle, but somebody who would compete with T.S. Eliot
Hmm.
for fame and for literary standing.
Hmm.
So really, that high standard, I think, is very important to an understanding of Porter's mindset, and the sense that she had made it out of Texas, she had made it out of the provinces, she'd gotten away from that abusive first marriage, and she wasn't going to be anybody's fool. She was going to be her own woman, and do what she had to do. And if it takes 30 years, then it takes 30 years. Now, that's the sort of positive reading of it.
Hmm.
There is the more attenuated reading of it, where you could say she was sidetracked by, wanting to have a nice place to live and wondering what houses she wanted to live in. There is that whole
Love
story,
affairs.
houses and addresses and
Yeah.
affairs and looking for relationships that would work and wanting to be attractive and loved and admired. All of that is also part of Porter's temperament and personality.
Yeah, but she certainly knew how to write a bestseller. Ship of Fools outsold every other American novel in 1962.
60,
So,
yes.
yeah, so she knew how
Yeah,
to write a bestseller. So she could have written maybe more bestsellers. And being
yeah.
so,
And it
being,
is too bad. It really is too bad that there were two or three early bad critiques by people who just didn't see this book as the success that it could have been.
Mhm,
And that sort of nipped in the bud some possibilities that might have made it even greater.
mhm.
But there's a fantastic little cultural reference. I need to think back to this now. I believe I mentioned it in the preface to the 2012 book on the essays. Um, in this TV series, Mad Men, about the Madison Avenue advertisement people, there's a moment in which one of the main characters, Betty Draper, is sitting at home, waiting for something to happen. And she opens a book, and you can see the title of the book, and it's Ship of Fools.
Mm.
So, of all of the books that she could have opened on that moment in 1962, that the directors and the producers of the series could have put into her hands, that is the book they
Mhm.
put into her hands, testifying to what you just said was the phenomenal success of the book in the bookstores.
Yeah. And this will lead me to my last question, because I am fairly judgmental when it comes to the literary quality of things. I'm always in bookstores browsing, reading the first paragraph of one book, the last paragraph of another, just immediately saying, well, this is just trash, or this has literary quality. And sometimes it's hard to find that perfect combination of literary merit with somebody who really knows how to tell a story and keep you interested. Um, and I don't know if Porter was trying to achieve that balance or not. But just from a literary quality standpoint, I remember one critic saying about this story that the first half was magnificent, implying that the second half was not. Do you think the first half is better than the second half, and do you think the story stands the test of time? And then the big question is, what can we learn from it that might apply to our world today?
I'm inclined to see the whole Leaning Tower as one narrative arc, and not a first half and a second half.
Mhm.
You obviously need the setup, and the story very quickly goes into the setup, and it goes into Kuno, who we later learn has died, and it goes into the motivations of why Charles Upton is in Berlin in the first place and what he's looking for there. And so those expectations that are then thwarted are thwarted by what happens in the second half of the story. I don't think that the first and the second half can be thought of necessarily as separate. The first one's more interior monologue, and the second one is more direct conversation between people. So I'm not worried about the coherence of the story or which half is better and which half is worse. Thinking of it as one narrative arc. Um, does it stand the test of time? You know, one is surprised which stories stand the test of time and when they come back. Think of the pandemic just a couple of years ago, and Pale Horse all of a sudden coming back into
Mhm.
fashion,
Mhm.
because it is one of the very, very, very few, if not the only, readily available American text that deals with a pandemic
Mhm.
and the human consequences thereof.
Sure.
Um, there are a few others. There are a few other episodes in other books that deal with the big flu of 1918. But still, it sort of comes back, and all of a sudden people reappreciate it. Now, is there a moment for the Leaning Tower to come back? Maybe there is. And this is getting very speculative and somewhat dramatic, and it depends on how far you're willing to go with this. But I mean, we're living in a pretty critical moment currently. Um, the 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 political world situation, in particular from a European point of view, is anything but settled. We don't know what's going to happen to Ukraine, Russia. We don't know what's going to happen to NATO. We know that whatever seemed to be true in the last 60 years seems not to be true anymore, and we don't know what will take its place. So it depends on how far you want to go with this. I would have to leave it to people to speculate on their own. I am not a political scientist, and I'm certainly not a futurist, so I'm not going to go there. But literature is not a bad place to go to if you want to think more deeply about the present.
And I'm sorry, I do have to throw in one more question since I get personal with Porter. I have to get personal with you. I know you've been retired now. You told me for 3 weeks,
Yes.
officially retired. So tell our audience how you're enjoying your retirement. What do you plan to do in your retirement, or just do nothing at all, which is what retirement means? Or are you going to maybe do you still write about Porter, or do any writing? Just kind of give us the picture of what your life is going to be like
Yeah.
in the future.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. No, that is easier to do. I mean, the biggest difference between my life until this summer and my life from here on out is the regular teaching. I
Mhm.
mean, as a university professor, teaching and examining and supervising thesis writing was all encompassing and all absorbing. And whatever thinking and writing one does in addition, especially in the kind of job that I've had here, is supportive of that. But you have a job to do. So I no longer have to prepare classes for this fall term, which is quite an adjustment
Yes.
after nearly 40 years of teaching.
Yeah, wow.
That's interesting. I am making a point of not going from 100% to 0%, but stepping down very, very slowly. I have a couple of articles that I'm working on. I have half a book that I managed to write but didn't manage to finish. So there is the other half that needs to be written, and I think that's a realistic goal. I have a couple of obligations with local and regional high schools in Switzerland where I'm advising on their English programs because, of course, English is a foreign language here. We speak a lot of languages in Switzerland, but English isn't one of the local languages.
Mhm.
German, French, and Italian are the national languages.
Mhm.
So, but English is super important, and people want to know how to run an English program and what I can do for that and with that, because my job has been to educate high school teachers of English.
Mhm.
in addition to supervising the occasional doctorate and teaching American Lit. So I certainly have a lot of plans, and I hear from my retired colleagues that retirees have less time in their schedules than anybody else they know because they have so many things that they're doing. I
Yeah.
can see myself going that way. I will have a lot of things to do.
Yeah, you don't have to just automatically vegetate when you
Oh
retire.
no, oh
Well, I
no.
work for a financial planning firm. I'm a remote employee, and I've taken notes in meetings. And people say they're retired, and you hear about all these things they're doing in retirement. That's not retirement.
Yeah,
they're still even working, but they still say they're
yeah.
retired. But I guess when they go
Well,
from full time to
the
part time, in
word
their mind, that means they're retired.
the word is probably a misnomer
Yes.
when it comes to the semantic meaning of retirement. It just seems the wrong word. But it is a kind of an ontological change, just like when you get your PhD is an ontological change and you become a different kind of person on that day. You supposedly become a different kind of person when you retire, and um, uh, it opens new perspectives.
Will you
And
continue to do any writing like
yeah,
about Porter specifically, or
well, whether it's specifically Porter, I don't know. In the last couple of years, I've been really working mostly on poetry.
okay?
Uh, and I am continuing to work on poetry and on poetic theory. I have a couple of articles coming out on the sestina, which which is a sort of a rare but fascinating form. And that is the kind of thing I will pursue, not more on the sestina, but probably more on poetry and how it works.
If I know Sestina's, I could be totally wrong. Would you say that Elizabeth Bishop's One Art is that an example of a Sestina?
Elizabeth Bishop, one art is not an example of a sestina,
Okay,
but Elizabeth Bishop is famous for some sestinas,
okay,
uh, and one of them is simply called Sestina, and it's the one about the grandmother and the house and the child and the stove.
okay.
One art, if I'm not
What's a
mistaken,
villanelle?
is a Villanelle.
Villanelle. Yeah, I
Let's
always get those
go with
confused. Yeah. Now I'm
that.
sounding really stupid. I shouldn't have said anything. But however, I will say I think Elizabeth Bishop's One Art is the greatest villanelle ever written. I'll make that bold statement now that I've got clear what type of poem it is. But well, I've written
Well,
three,
it's a fantastic poem, but there's some really good villanelles out there.
and also Edwin Arlington Robinson's
Yes,
about the house.
yes,
That
yes,
that's one of the greatest ones too. What is it called? The House on the Hill. House on the Hill.
yes.
That's I believe that's a villanelle. Well, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you for.
Sure.
I always love interviewing people who are so educated and well spoken, and they put me all to shame. But I just at least I can learn something. Hopefully, our audience can learn something. And everybody's always illuminated everything for our audience so well, and you've definitely done that today with the Leaning Tower. So I want to thank you for doing this, and maybe we'll touch base sometime about some other aspect of Porter. Hopefully, we'll keep in touch. Okay.
It's been my pleasure, and I want to thank you for contacting me. It's certainly been a lot of fun. And one thing about retirement is that you can easily find an hour when you can do an interview like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I am surprised that we carried on for a whole hour and it
Yes.
didn't get boring for a moment. So
Well,
this has
I
been,
hope not. This is the longest interview I've ever done. I always think I sound like a babbling idiot, so I just let my guests do most of the most of the talking.
I hope when I see this online that I don't sound like a babbling idiot, but I'm just gonna have to let it happen.
Well, thanks
So thank
again.
you,
You
Alan.
take care.
All the best to you. Take care.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.